Let me welcome all of you. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to St. Thomas More as we gather here for this very important topic, which has tremendous ramifications for our church. And as we talk about it, I think one of the underlying aspects we always have to keep in mind is the victims, those who have suffered sexual abuse, primarily by clergy, recognizing them, praying for their healing, and likewise at the same time praying for justice and right for each victim and their families, the others who are so affected by that. I'm going to ask that we just gather our thoughts for a quiet prayer, particularly our victims, and commending them to God's mercy that justice and right will be done for them and that they will find healing and inner peace. Thank you very much. John Carr, who is our speaker this evening, I met in the late 1990s when I was the Director of Continuing Education for the Archdiocese of Hartford. And he was one of the speakers on a program that we sponsored called Preaching the Just Word by Father Walter Burkhardt, a Jesuit priest, who had this wonderful program, and we met. John gave one of the talks on it, particularly the social justice aspect of preaching the just word. And one of John's favorite lines, I've heard him repeat it several times because I've heard him in other talks, is that Catholic social teachings, unfortunately, are the best kept secret. We just don't get them out there. John is the founder and director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. Previously, for 20 years, John served as director of the Department of Justice, Peace, and Human Development at the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. He's been Secretary for Social Concerns for the Archdiocese of Washington, a columnist for America, and a fellow at the Harvard Institute of Politics. And he's currently the chair of the board of Bread for the World. Most recently, John was the 2019 recipient of the Cardinal Bernardine Award for the Common Ground Initiative. This is located now at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, and it works to try to heal divisions in the church, the common ground that we have from various aspects in the church. So, John, congratulations on that award, well deserved. John is a survivor of clerical sexual abuse, as I'm sure you are aware. As you know, we mentioned that in our publicity here. As I have addressed this topic a number of times here at St. Thomas More in the short time I've been with you, we recognize how critical it is for us to have a big picture of it. And I'm sure this evening, John, who has addressed the crisis in America Magazine, on PBS, NewsHour, and in other venues, he will help us to explore that and give us some direction, as the title of his talk is, Personal Lessons and Pastoral Directions on the Clerical Sexual Abuse Crisis. John, welcome.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be off that train. 4-hour trip took about 6.5. I thought Father Jerry was going to have to give the talk, and I think he would do a great job. To be honest, even though I'm really happy to be here at St. Thomas More, I have very mixed feelings about tonight. I'm honored to be invited on this campus to this place. I have admired St. Thomas More for a long time. My own experience is people often talk about how terrific the building is and how great all that is. My experience is what's even more terrific is what you do. Every day, every night, every weekend, and how you do it. I mean, this is a great example of sharing the good news in a really important place. So I want to just say thank you for the honor of being here. I'm happy to be with my friend Carrie Robinson. To be honest, about halfway here, I thought, this is a plot to get even with me for all the times I've asked Carrie to come to Washington. And on this train, she's teaching me the sacrifice she's made. So I'm happy to be here because of where we are, what you do, and who invited me. I'm anxious. I am not an expert. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a theologian. I'm not an attorney. Even though I work at Georgetown, I'm barely an academic. Before I went to Georgetown 5 years ago, my experience with Jesuit higher education was paying for it. And Father mentioned the principles of Catholic social teaching. In my experience, the way the Jesuits practice the option for the poor is by making me poor. My Ivy League credentials are even more meager. I was a residential fellow at a place you may have heard of called Harvard, and I was sort of an unlikely fellow. When we told our children that Linda and I were going to Cambridge to be a fellow at the Institute for Politics, my son Tim said, "Are we talking the real Harvard?" Turns out what a fellow does, in addition to teaching a class, you talk and you eat. And I'm good at talking, you'll judge that for yourself, but I'm certainly good at eating. So I was a natural-born fellow. One of the great joys of my life, and this will tick everybody off, at my time at Harvard, the week that everybody was talking about the game, I'd say, you betcha, Notre Dame's going to beat Boston College. They didn't think it was funny. So I'm not going to share my expertise tonight. I'm going to share my experience. And that experience is based on several things. In a very fundamental way, it's being a parent, a dad, now a grandparent. I've worked in 2 dioceses. I come from Minnesota. I'm a product of a mixed marriage. My mother's from St. Paul and my dad from Minneapolis. They're both Catholics, but that's a big deal. And I've lived and worked in Washington for decades. Washington is ground zero of this phase of the sexual abuse crisis. Cardinal McCarrick was our Archbishop, Cardinal Wuerl. The word is tomorrow we're going to get a new Archbishop, and the hurt and the anger is intense. So we pray for our new Archbishop and pray for a new beginning. But mostly I have spent my work in service of the church, and as was mentioned at the Catholic Bishops' Conference, 25 years there. I once said to one of the bishops, when limbo went into limbo, I said I never understood limbo, what happened to those children. I'm sure they're okay. But I don't have any strong attachment to limbo, but don't mess with purgatory, because working for you has to count. And working at the Bishops' Conference during the sex abuse crisis, there were days that felt like purgatory and worse. Now I'm at Georgetown at this new initiative. I used to have the most pompous title in Washington. Father said it. How would you like to be Secretary of Justice, Peace, and Human Development for the U.S. Catholic Bishops? Carrie's heard me tell the story so many times. It's true. It happened in Chicago. I had a big name card. Somebody came up to me and read the card, turned to his spouse, and he said, he's in charge of justice, peace, and human development for the U.S. Catholic bishops. And she looked at me and said, you need to do a better job. Well, that was true. We need to do a better job of responding to victims and renewing and reforming our church. We do a couple things at our center. I had the most pompous title. Now I have the most boring. We had a contest for the most boring title you could have. The Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. It's not exciting, but it describes what we do. We do large public dialogues. We've had, in 5 years, we've had more than 60 More than 20,000 people have come. There is a hunger for what our faith offers. We reach out to young people in ways not unlike what's done here. Young people in Washington who come to save the world and are drawn into the political wars and the partisan battles. And we want to remind them that their faith can be an asset in not only their personal lives, but their work lives. And we pull leaders together once a year to talk about important things. Last year, polarization. This year, we'll talk about the responsibility, the obligation of lay leaders to step up. In that process, we don't normally focus on ecclesial matters. We focus on the connection of the church and the world, but you can't do that in this context without talking about the ways in which this crisis has undermined the voice of the church in the world. So we have done 4 sessions. We did one for young people, and for this was new news and generated great anger. We did one for the whole community where we mostly listened to survivors, 4 of the 5 people, and the hurt and the loss and the costs. We gathered in our chapel to pray and reflect on what the Lord might call us to do. And just recently we had a session on what happened over in Rome with one of the leaders of that, but Father Zollner. But we insisted that he listen to a survivor in the United States and listen to a parish that had talked about this. And next Tuesday, we're having a day-long session on how law and lawyers helped uncover this crisis and in some ways might have made it worse. So that's what I bring. The other thing I bring is, frankly, 50 years of dealing with this. For me, this is personal, this is professional, this is institutional. The Leadership Roundtable and others have made important distinctions saying this is a twin crisis. There's the crisis of abuse, where young people were harmed in horrible ways, and there is a crisis of leadership, where that was enabled or ignored or overlooked. And frankly, I've been touched by both those crises. So what I would like to do is talk about how this has haunted me, affected me, tested my faith, and what lessons I have drawn from this. You've heard of the 10 Commandments? I have 10 lessons, and I'm going to go through them quickly because I have to catch that train on the way back. The first lesson came from my experience working in the Archdiocese of Washington. I was head of a big secretariat, and I was called in, and a senior cleric was accused, credibly accused, is the words we use now, of harming young people. And around that table were a group of priests, bishops mostly, and me. And for them, this was just impossible. They knew this, Monsignor. Couldn't have happened. This was a horrible mistake. This was a terrible fight inside the agency. It just couldn't be. They had gone to school with him. And I didn't know him. And it came around to me. Cardinal Hickey was great. He asked everyone their view. I said, I don't know the Monsignor, but I'm a dad. And I know my sons. And if you had an investigation and found out that someone had done this to my sons, short of murder, this was just about the worst thing I could imagine. It affects their attitudes towards themselves, their faith, the priesthood, the Eucharist, their parents, their church, their sexuality. I said, short of murder, this is the worst thing I could imagine. And to his great credit, Cardinal Hickey, I think the vote was 5-1, and he said, I'm with the 1. Well, the lesson I drew from that, and it's still true, is we need more parents in the room. We need more dads and moms, especially moms. We need survivors in the room who look at this through the eyes of victims and their families, not just the eyes of priests. and clerics. The second thing I learned, also at the Archdiocese, on lesson number 2, we need lay leaders, as I said, in the room helping make these decisions. But we have to acknowledge that lay leaders enabled this as well. We're going to talk about the lawyers that told Archbishop Hickey, Cardinal Hickey, I'll handle this. Don't apologize. Don't meet with victims. We'll get confidentiality agreements. The therapists who said, we can fix this. You know, they took our money and they took our priests and they said they're okay, put them back in ministry. And a lot of those people were lay people. But the difference was they were looking to protect the institution and their own interests rather than protect the family of faith. So we need more lay leaders, but they need to be focused on the vulnerable, not the institutions. I want lay people involved not only in review boards, but also in finance and governance. I especially want them involved in the formation and selection and evaluation of clergy. But I want the first 5 people in my parish who volunteer to be disqualified. I mean, we have some crazy people who, you know, come, they're mad about everything. So we need the range of views in the church. The other thing is where we have made progress on getting lay people in the room, very often they're very powerful, very affluent, very well connected lay leaders, mostly men, mostly Anglos. They do great work, in my experience, but they're not the whole church. We need the Latino plumber in the room. We need the housekeeper in the room, the DRE director also in the room. So we have to reflect the diversity of our church, ethnically, racially, ideologically, and yes, economically. Third lesson came from my time at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. I told you it was sometimes like purgatory. It was also occasionally like heaven. I got to see people standing up for human life and dignity in this country and around the world in a way that made me proud to be a part of this family of faith. I worked with many bishops, but I worked with, I think, every cardinal that has had to resign because of this. At the height of the Boston scandals, I worked directly with Cardinal Law. And at the same time, and we accomplished some important things working together. And at that same time, I was the father of teenage boys. And a couple people know me here. I am a loyal, respectful staff person. I admire bishops. But I try and tell them the truth. And a couple of times I tried to tell Cardinal Law the truth. And he looked at me and said, no one talks to me the way you do. And it wasn't a compliment. And I wasn't being disrespectful. But what it told me is that our leaders are too often isolated. And therefore they lack the awareness, the empathy, the curiosity, the experience that allows them to feel the anguish and the anger and the horror. He, among others, said, this is all about our enemies. It's about the media. This is about the lawyers, whatever. And turned his look outward instead of inward. And we have paid a terrible price for that. And candidly, in my experience working at the conference, this was not marginal. I worked with Cardinal Mahoney. I worked with Cardinal Wuerl. I worked with Cardinal Law, and Cardinal McCarrick is a dear friend. So what I learned is our leaders can be isolated, walled off, and that sometimes they're surrounded by people who either are afraid or unwilling to challenge assumptions and behaviors. That's the third lesson. The fourth lesson is a very tough one for me. Cardinal McCarrick is a dear friend. I traveled with him, great supporter of mine, knows my family. I was contacted by a journalist who said that they had heard about these rumors of Cardinal McCarrick's behaviors, and this was with seminarians, not with young people, not with minors. And I looked on the web, and there were these things, and I looked at Cardinal McCarrick directly, and I said, Cardinal, what is this? What is going on here? Where is this coming from? I can remember where it was, on the steps, on the sidewalk in front of Theological College in Washington. He looked me directly in the face, and he said, John, if any of that were true, I wouldn't be here. This has been investigated by the newspapers, by others. I could not be here if any of that were true. And I admit that's what I wanted to hear. But it seemed incredible to me that he could have done those things and be Cardinal Archbishop of Washington. So my lesson from that is no matter who, a friend, a foe, a big shot, a cardinal, a prince of the church, everybody has to be accountable. Everybody has to have a supervisor. Everybody has to be accountable for their behavior. For me, there are lots of things that are really complicated about this. 3 things are not complicated for me. You expect me to keep my vows, keep yours. I will do anything in the world to protect my children and grandchildren. You need to do everything in the world to protect our children. I am accountable for what I do and don't do. You need to be accountable for what you do and don't do. That's number 4. Number 5, some of you may recall that in the middle of this mess, Archbishop Vigano wrote a long public letter going after lots of people, but especially Pope Francis. And he used the sexual abuse crisis to go after the Holy Father, to go after people, LGBTQ people, liberals, the Second Vatican Council, you name it. It was quite a diatribe. Well, I actually have had some experience with Archbishop Vigano. I'm from the Archdiocese of Minneapolis-St. Paul. St. Paul, Minneapolis, I got to get that right. And I was meeting with Archbishop Vigano about something else, but the Archbishop of St. Paul, Minneapolis was complicit in all of this. There was an investigation. We later found out that Archbishop Vigano stopped the investigation. But I was there to talk about my work at Georgetown, and I said, this may be an inappropriate conversation, but I just have to tell you, that's my home diocese. And this archbishop can't be archbishop. He's destroying the church. And it's the best people who are hurt the most. And he looked at me and he said, we can't give in to the media and the lawyers. And I said, every day he's there is a good day for the adversaries of the church. And what I learned from that, I think I'm on number 5, is be very wary of those who would weaponize this scandal for their own ideological or ecclesial agendas. They usually don't have the interests of survivors at heart. They have another agenda. For me, and now we're at number 6, law, McCarrick, Vigano. This is not about theology, ideology, ecclesiology. This is about power. The abuse of power, and therefore the abuse of people, trust, authority, resources, and faith. So some suggest the whole problem is celibacy, or the problem is homosexuality, or the problem is Vatican II, or we didn't implement Vatican II. The problem is a male priesthood. The problem is this. The problem is that. I think we ought to talk about all those things. But what is at heart here is a destructive clerical and episcopal culture that leaves our leaders isolated, lacking empathy, without challenge, without evaluation, even without training or the relationships to be the pastors we need them to be. So one of the lessons is beware of those who would turn this abuse of power into an ideological or ecclesial fight. This should be one thing that pulls us together. We can divide up the work, but we shouldn't divide the church. And we ought to come out of our bunkers and our factions and try and work together for the good of the church. Seventh lesson. This is a hard one for me. I love Pope Francis. His simple ways and his powerful words, the way he looks at the world from the bottom up and the outside in, the way he challenges me every day. I love those homilies. You know, they're short. They say, God loves you. You're doing good. You can do better. That's about all I can handle on a day. But he was slow to act on this. And he was wrong about some things. If you have not seen it, the Vatican meeting that just happened, there were 3 women who spoke at that meeting. Some people say only 3, and others say 3 women? This is a breakthrough. But a sister from Africa leaned over. She's about 5 feet from the Holy Father. She says, Brother Francis, you were wrong about Chile. And you admitted it. You listened to survivors, and you taught us all a lesson. Listen to survivors and admit your mistakes. There's a lesson there. When Pope Francis gets it right, it's because he has listened to the voices of survivors. And that's true for him, it's true for our leaders, and it's true for us. Number 8. When I was talking to someone close to the Holy Father, Father Spadaro, a Jesuit that runs a big magazine, and I said I thought the Holy Father's silence about this, and particularly about the Vigano attacks, was not very good. And I said silence may be good Jesuit discipline, but it's not leadership. And I said, none of us can be silent about this. And I talked to a lot of journalists. And I said, silence and secrecy is a big part of this problem. And then I had to face the fact that I had been silent. I have my own secrets about this. When I was 14 years old, I went to a high school seminary in Minnesota. I got a great education, a strong formation, made wonderful friends. But I also experienced sexual harassment and abuse. It wasn't the horrors of what was in the grand jury, but it was wrong. It was evil. I never told my parents. I had never told my wife, certainly never told my kids, not even the bishops. And as I was telling other people that silence is not an option, I had to face the fact that my silence was a part of the problem. And other people have spoken up more powerfully, more quickly, more strongly, and I admire them. Some of it's a little creepy, but some of it is a sign of solidarity. I was on the PBS NewsHour, and I've been on the NewsHour a couple times. You can find out which of your friends are very highfalutin. They watch the NewsHour. And I like talking about poverty or the Pope. And I was invited on the NewsHour to talk about my experience with sexual abuse. And I was not very comfortable with that. And when it was all over, and I was sort of wondering a cameraman came up to me, and he reached out his hand and says, "Thank you for doing that. That happened to me too." So there's something to be said for ending silence. That's number 9. Number 10, we have to keep the focus on victims. We should not move on. We should not minimize this. We should not push it into a corner. We should also not lose perspective. And I don't want this to be misunderstood. We are more than our institutional failures. Our leaders are more than our worst mistakes. Our church is more than this scandal. As I said, I don't want to minimize anything. But in addition to this, we stand up for human life and dignity. We shelter the homeless tonight. We educate young people across this country. Around the world, Catholic Relief Services is in 100 of the poorest places on earth in our name. The Holy Father is standing up for immigrants, and so is our church. Every weekend, millions of us gather for an hour to reflect on how we can be better people and to worship our Lord. We shouldn't minimize our failures, but we shouldn't only be our failures. One of the things that worries me a lot, and this is part of number 10, is that this crisis and the inability of our leaders to face up to it has undermined the voice of the church at a time when our nation needs the good news of the gospel, needs the principles of Catholic social teaching on the unborn and the undocumented, on the poor and the vulnerable, for justice, for religious liberty. So we need to fix this, not simply to fix an institution or to reform a process, but to permit us to be the Church of Jesus Christ, to get us focused on mission again. So none of us can be silent. None of us can abandon the effort, because we all are the church. I said at the beginning I was going to share 10 lessons from 50 years of dealing with this, from a high school in Minnesota to the nation's capital. I'd like to close with something else. Those have been tough 50 years. They've tested my faith in lots of ways. But I have had another story in those 50 years. It's a story of blessing, of the opportunity to be a part of this family of faith, to stand up for what we believe, to raise my kids, to defend the weak and the vulnerable, to share the gospel. And so my message tonight, my 10 lessons are: don't minimize, don't ignore. Let's learn the lessons that we have. Let's make this right. Let's get lay people into leadership in our church. Let's hold our leaders accountable, and let us carry out the mission of the church, to bring good news to the poor, liberty to captives, new sight to the blind, and as Jesus said, to set the downtrodden free. Thank you very much.
We have a good amount of time for some questions and dialogue here. John does have a train at 8:06, so
probably late.
Okay, then we'll try to get you down there by 9, John. Okay. First and foremost, thank you for your openness, your insights, and your direction and your candor. And not only what your own experience is, but in terms of your personal experience, but also your work ethic and the many ways that you have interacted with our leaders and pointed out to them where they need to be hearing and listening and open. So thank you for that. One thing that you did say that I really appreciated, that this is something that can bring us together, but we know that it's dividing us very much. You and I were both in Ford. We will have questions. I'm just going to monopolize this for a few minutes since both of us were at Fordham last week. I don't know if you remained for the entire first session with the 2 women from John Jay College. I made some reference to this at one of the masses I was at this weekend, but would you want to comment on 2 things? The consistency of the statistics, no matter, maybe 3 things. The consistency of the statistics as they go across the world. Number 2, their declaration from the statistics that they get, the hard data that they get, it's not a celibacy or homosexual issue. And thirdly, oh, you weren't there, it was Father Zollner, went on to say, following the Holy Father's meeting, some of the bishops in emerging nations, if I can use that phrase, are only beginning to get this and really haven't opened up to what the struggle is. And so Father Zollner said, this is going to go on for years. Am I putting you on the spot to answer all this? Yeah, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do they know who Father Zollner is?
Yeah.
Okay.
We actually had a session with Father Zollner about 10 days ago. With those questions, I think my train is leaving early. I'm not a data person. There are a couple things that struck me. I did hear their presentation. One thing is it's really important to look at the facts because emotion, indifference, prejudice, where we stand, who we admire, can affect how we see things. And what the John Jay study did back 15 years ago, but since then, indicated that this particular evil haunted not a corner of our church, but a significant chunk of our church. And 4 or 5% was the number they used, and it was pretty consistent. I was in the high school seminary from 64 to 68. Be fair to say I fell in that period of the peak problem here. And I was struck by how, frankly, pervasive it was across the country, in Australia, in France, in Germany, in Ireland, in Chile now. So those who say this American problem, this is hedonism, this is your courts, this is your lack of fidelity, wait. The second thing was data gets in the way of our ideology. And frankly, progressives tend to say, you know, if we got rid of celibacy, we'd solve this. And some people on the right say if we got rid of homosexual priests, gay priests, we'd solve this. Don't run me out of town. I have 2 thoughts on that. If we got rid of celibacy, first of all, I think that'd be a loss in many ways because of the priests I know and admire. But secondly, I think we would have probably some better homilies, but a different form, but a very real form of sex abuse. Watch the Southern Baptist Convention. And on gay priests, I have 2 thoughts, and just to not be quoted on this. My first thought is, if we got rid of all the gay priests, who would say Mass? And secondly, we're the largest employer of gay people in the world, probably. And the originators of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And like everybody, there are wonderful leaders and there are people that have done terrible things. But the interesting thing for me is people make a much bigger deal about gay men in the priesthood in the last 20 or 30 years. Guess what? That's not when we had the high levels of sexual abuse of minors. We should not take great pride in the fact that there are dozens, not hundreds, of victims now. But we can acknowledge that what happened in 2002, the policies that were adopted, zero tolerance, the review boards, and safeguarding. I can't go into a diocese without being checked out, has made a difference. And one of the things Father Zollner would say is this is a global problem, and be really careful about imposing, everything you think ought to happen in your culture on another culture. But there's no one standing up more strongly and saying, but this is unacceptable in every culture, even though it takes different forms. So have I dodged those effectively? All right.
We're open to some questions. You want to come forward? We're live streaming. Bruce, want to come up?
Well, I can hear you from here. Cardinal Pell, of course, was convicted and spending 2 years in prison in Australia. Why aren't more of the American bishops facing charges in the court system? Covering up pedophilia is a crime, is it not?
What?
Why aren't more of the American bishops facing charges in the court system in America for covering up pedophilia?
Thank you. I hope nobody will consider me an apologist for the evil that was done in the church, but it's pretty clear this was a society-wide problem and that our laws were not adequate. They did not mandate reporting not only of bishops, but of schools or of institutions or hospitals. Thankfully, that has changed, and the first obligation anybody has when this has been done is to call it for what it is, a crime, and report it to the authorities. So in many cases, it wasn't a crime not to report. Secondly, there's a big debate in this country, if not us, I don't know about Australia, about statutes of limitations and how long after a crime has been committed you can act to punish someone for committing that crime or aiding or covering that crime. I think those things have changed dramatically, and that's all to the good. It would be fair to say, I think, with only a couple of exceptions, this is the country in the world where 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bishops have been forced out for their lack of leadership in this area. And I don't think we're the only ones that are responsible for this. This is an area where I think a lot more work has to be done. And one of the things that Pope Francis has done is, in addition to setting down some basic guidelines, he said this is fundamentally requires a conversion. He talks about the culture that permits it and abets it. And at first, I'll be honest, I was disappointed with that talk. I was waiting for this, and this. And then I came to the conclusion I expressed in my little reflection that underneath all this is a culture of entitlement and abuse of power that has to be broken in order for us to move forward. So I think in some ways, since 2000, the civil law, the canon law, has caught up, and children are much more safe in our institutions than they ever were. My concern now is, will the ecclesial and clerical culture catch up to what's needed as well? So.
Mary?
I can only speak that I've had very good experiences in my lifetime, but I can't imagine what it would be like to be a parent and have someone, and I can picture my own parents. They would be absolutely ready to send me to the moon if I implied in any way, shape, or form that a priest had done anything. It's quite a barrier for a kid to come and say these things and to be acknowledged and carried through. I think it should be more in the pulpit. There should be sessions in Catholic churches that people really speak about this. I think the Protestants would have handled it far better with all different kinds of educational things and so forth.
I certainly agree with the first part of that. One of the people we had at our sessions spoke for the first time about his own experience of being abused beginning at 9 years old. And when he told his father about this, his father beat him. And so it not only destroyed his relationship with the church, in some ways it fundamentally damaged his relationship with his father. And so the pain and the loss is, ripples out. I do think I hope parents are different today. I assume it's true here. If you have children in a Catholic school, you learned a ton about this and about boundaries and how to talk to your children and the rest. I actually think the Catholic Church, for reasons that are not a silver lining, is a much safer place for young people than it was, and that most other places are today. But we paid an unacceptable price for that. So, one of the things we were talking about celibacy, and I don't live here, I can just sort of pop off. Although there is a camera. I think the part of celibacy that I would focus on, and I've already expressed my admiration for priests who live celibacy generously and faithfully, is not that they're not married, it's that they're not parents. Because the level of loss and anger, you spend your whole, I've said this to bishops, I said you spend your whole life trying to keep your kids close to the church, and you find out you put them at risk in doing that. Do you have any idea the level of horror and anger that creates? So, way in the back, come on up. Gene.
As a survivor over the years, what have you found to be the biggest source of help for you in coming to terms and learning to accept everything? And
well, I'm a new survivor. I mean, I'm just sort of coming to grips with this. So I look to others. I think there is some freedom that comes from naming this. We had a survivor talk when on the panel with Father Zollner, and he said the most important message for survivors is 5 words: this is not your fault. What I have found in talking to other people who have been through the experience that I've had, some far worse, is the silence, the secrecy, the self-blaming is destructive. The not knowing how to share it with family and friends, and a church which for too long has tried at best to hush it up and in other ways to blame victims. When I worked for Cardinal Hickey, I listen to diocesan attorneys say, you should not meet with victims or their families. You should not apologize. We will handle this. We will give them money and they will be quiet and we can go on about our business. And I think that was destructive in lots of ways. To his credit, Cardinal Hickey ignored that advice. And Washington has been one of the better places in a sad history.
Chief? Mr. Carr, your speech wasn't long enough, and I brought enough money in my wallet to buy you another train ticket if you have to switch trains.
There must be an airport near here.
I think all of us can't wait for you to come back again because we have so much more to talk about, especially sensitive subjects like homosexuality and lesbianism, which is not the subject because 50 years ago I thought about that as a real difference and unacceptable, and now I know how many of my respected, admired, wonderful friends are different from the way I am. But is there a way to infuse women into leadership in the church? And is there anything in the Bible or doctrine which prohibits changing the balance a lot? Thanks a lot, Mr. Carr.
That train is definitely leaving. Actually, I think Carrie ought to answer this. I'll talk as a parent of daughters, father of daughters. It seems to me an incredible paradox. If you look at the local parish, if you look at Catholic healthcare, if you look at Catholic education, if you look at Catholic charities, which Pope Benedict said are at the heart of our faith, equal to the Eucharist, women are the leaders of those ministries. When my girls were growing up and I was trying to hold them close to the church, and it was said that, some things were not open to that. At that time, it was altar girls. One of my daughters said, T-ball has handled this. Why can't the church? I think it's getting better. I think you can't figure a way out of this much trouble and ignore half of the community, including the most active part of the community. I already said I think mothers and women ought to be especially in the room. When there were three things about the Rome meeting that impressed me. One was it was genuinely global. And this has been dismissed as a problem of the West or some parts of Latin America. Secondly, the most powerful messages came from women. I mentioned the sister from Africa who didn't take on the Holy Father, acknowledged his leadership, but also said to my brothers from Africa who say this is not a problem, let me tell you about the problem. And my favorite line was, who are these young seminarians wandering around Rome like they know everything? Which is the question I have. There was a canon lawyer who specified how the law, and one of the bishops, I was not there, but my colleague Kim Daniels said he had never heard of a woman who was a canon lawyer. I mean, this was a revelation to him. And then the third woman who spoke was a journalist who just laid down the law and says, you have to decide, are you with the wolves or are you with the people the wolves are after? And if you're with the wolves, we're coming after you. Now, my brother was a journalist, and it's a little more complicated than that. But A couple of the bishops who were there told me there were two lessons from this. One is sex abuse is a global problem, and there can never be another Vatican meeting where only men talk, which will mean there will be very different Vatican meetings. The other thing, and it's not responsive to your question, but really struck me, you asked about a survivor. If you've not seen it, the repentance service, it's in one of these amazing halls in the Vatican, and it looks like the Sistine Chapel, but it's not. And a young man, never told us his name, told his story of being abused with some detail. And at the end said, you should hear this story and I should be the one to tell you. And with that, he stopped and he picked up a violin. Turns out he's a world-class musician and played this piece of music that I had never heard. But there are some things that are so sad that only art can help us express it. So that would be worth a look if you've not seen it. So this is one of the major challenges. I'll tell you one thing we do. We do all sorts of dialogues. We never have just guys talking about it. We never have just Anglos talking about it. We never have just white people talking about it. And that's got to be a standard, I think, for all of us.
Thank you.
Somebody else.
And something about increasing lay leadership. Could you expound on that for some of us to give us a little guidance?
This is something I've spent my life on. I think I admire priests. I deeply admire the women religious who form me. I think the most exciting vocation in the church is being a layperson, called to be salt, light, and leaven in a society that needs salt, light, and leaven. And so after 25 years of trying to help the bishops be the best they could be, I said, why don't we help lay people, especially young people, know this tradition and have ways to take it into the public arena. Somebody asked, how was 2018? And I said, I work on faith and public life. My church is in crisis, my country's in chaos, and the Capitol is a disaster. It's going just great, you know? We're really being very successful. So I tell the people I ask to give us resources, that just shows we're more necessary than ever. But I really do believe it. I don't like talking about silver linings. I think one of the obligations of this moment, when the voice of the institutional church and the hierarchy has been diminished, yet the need to stand up for human life and dignity is more important than ever, we simply have to find ways for lay people to make that case, especially given, frankly, the failures of a whole range of political leaders. One of the things we're doing, our little initiative, is we're going to have sort of a summit of summits where we try and bring the people from across the country who have done things, put us in a room and say, okay, after a year and a half of horror, a year and a half of listening and thinking, what can we do together? And then the last day, I want to focus on how are we going to lift up the voice of the people of God in public life when our country is so divided and our leaders are so inadequate to the task. So the answer is, I think this is in many ways our moment. I don't have the vehicles yet, but I think, frankly, a place like this is really impressive. I mean, you think of the knowledge, the experience, the wisdom, the faith that gathers here every weekend. How do we put that to work in making this a better university, this place a better town, our church a better reflection of the love of God, our country a better example of liberty and justice for all? We simply have to find better ways, better vehicles to bring what we have into public life. So, back there.
How much of
problem.
Can you go to the mic? I have a hearing problem. It's great with grandchildren. We have 6 grandchildren under 7, and my most prized possessions are my hearing aids. Joe.
How are you?
Great to see you.
Good to see you.
You want to ask how lay people can make a difference? This guy makes a difference.
Tell me, how much of a problem is the bureaucracy at the Vatican?
Actually, it would take the whole train ride to answer this question. You know, I'm a bureaucrat. I've spent my life inside these things. Somebody said, I wrote the book on the preferential option for the bureaucrat. My favorite line about the Vatican, you probably all heard it. Someone asked Pope John the 23rd how many people work at the Vatican, and he said about half. Let me say this. Pope Francis is the most powerful cleric in the world, and he has decided that clericalism is the most serious problem in the church, and he is surrounded by the bastion of clericalism. So you think you have a tough job, whatever it is? He has a really tough job. The level of resistance, and I think they probably think they're right. Although, to be honest, I think a lot of the resistance to Pope Francis is not a contest over faith or morality. It's a battle over power, ecclesial, political, and economic power. When a pope, you know, we have to remember what a surprise he was. I was at Harvard when all this was happening, and I had a panel on the new pope. It was a classic, I shouldn't say this at Yale, but it was a classic academic panel where the professors all act like they saw it coming. Oh yes, it was time for a Jesuit. Oh yes, someone from the South. And I went, wait a minute. I said, if I had written a book that said, chapter 1 is the Pope resigns, says he can't do this anymore. Chapter 2, we follow an old Jesuit on the bus in Argentina. Chapter 3, the old Jesuit on the bus gets elected. He won't move into the palace, and he washes the feet of Muslim women and criminals on Holy Thursday. What would they tell me to do with my book? You know, don't waste our time. It'd be the best. It's a great story. I can't wait to see how it turns out. But it's a mortal sin to say what goes on in the conclave. So what does the Pope do? The day after he's elected, he calls a press conference to tell us what went on in the conclave. And he said when the votes were mounting, and it was getting dangerous, these are his words, his friend, Cardinal Hickey, leaned over, gave him a kiss, and said, don't forget about the poor. And he said, that's when I decided I'll call myself Francis, a man of the poor, a man of peace, and a man of creation. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have a poor church for the poor? Well, not everybody thinks that is wonderful. That's a real threat to people who have ecclesial, political, and economic power. So I think there is resistance in the Curia, there's resistance in our institutions. Frankly, there's resistance in my heart. I love Laudato Si, and the part where he says air conditioning, you know, might be a problem. I said to Linda, that is definitely not infallible. You know, I'm willing to sacrifice a little, but not a lot. So I think people miss him in that they try to view him through their own ideology. I find him challenging me every day in ways that I didn't anticipate. So Joe, I think there is enormous resistance. I think the bench is weak. I don't think he has the team of co-workers he needs. And therefore, I think it's incumbent on the rest of us to help him. And thank you for your work through all these years. over here.
Do we have time?
Oh, a lot of time. Doctor David.
So, I'm David. You said you're not... Is that better? So you said you're not a data man. I am a data man. First of all, thank you actually for being here, and thank you, Father Jerry, for bringing him, Sister Jen, for allowing me to pester them about doing this type of activity for months. So I do have a background in pediatrics, and when you look at the problem of pedophilia in society, so here's data. First, the average pedophile will be a perpetrator over 100 times before they get caught. Yeah. Secondly, most of these instances occur in a home by somebody the child already knows, usually within the family, and it happens between the age of 3 and 8 years old. And 1 in 10 children will suffer some form of sexual harassment before they reach the age of 18, again before the age of 10 is usually when it happens. None of this matches with what's happening in the church. So there's a problem at societal level, and we're seeing in the church is a reflection of that putridness in society. We like to think the church is not, we like to think the church is immune to it when it isn't. So my question is more of, we've seen this happen. The church is, as far as I know, the only institution that has taken broad action on this, and that arguably has given positive results. But it's really hard to get the baseline data and how all this happens so we can implement this outside of the church. So how do we as Catholics, not just as members of the church, but also as members of society, how do we take these lessons and implement them at a societal level so it starts happening not just within Catholicism, but without?
A train, John.
Yeah. I knew there would be smart people here, and that scared me. Facts matter, and so we've been calling this something that isn't. I mean, what you described is not what's happening, but there was a consistent pattern that affected thousands upon thousands of young people and involved thousands of priests. We have taken some steps that curb the abuse and the opportunity for abuse.
What is the data for that? I really don't know.
After 2002, the number of cases dropped precipitously and have not risen again. Some of the victims advocates say this is because people who don't talk about this for many years, like myself, haven't yet.
Is that a recurrence of new episodes?
Pardon?
Is that just a reporting bias? There was a flood of reports?
Actually, this thing from John Jay, they have really tried to study this because their credibility as researchers and analysts are a thing. Now, there still are cases. One of the things that I worry a lot about, and I show my ignorance, I think international priests, and we have wonderful international priests, and Latino communities, I think there is not the same vetting, I'm afraid, and care about who comes in. And I think there are cultural and other differences in the Latino community that may leave them more vulnerable. The only case in Washington in the last 10 years involved one of our most wonderful Latino parishes. And part of it was who would tell on Father. So, but getting back to, take a look at the John Jay study. I'll tell you who cannot make this case. Our bishops cannot make this case. Not the ones who were there, and not the ones who are trying to clean it up now. Pointing your finger at other institutions and saying we've done a wonderful job is not credible when you have a cardinal resigning for what he did to a 12-year-old, or cardinals resigning for their lack of action in earlier times. But I think this is something that lay people with expertise can talk about. You are right. The vast majority of abuse comes in the home. The vast majority of perpetrators are family members. This is a particular evil form of abuse because it involves questions of faith as well as family. One of the consistent patterns of this, and you probably understand this better, are priests who make themselves part of the family and then take advantage of people within the family. The person I was on the NewsHour with was a case. Her parents had essentially adopted this priest as a member of the family, and he would abuse her and then go down and say Mass in their home. I mean, particularly horrific. So my answer, my stumbling, bumbling answer is people like you who actually know the facts have to help make the case. Peter Steinfeld, if you've not read his piece in Commonweal, Peter is a terrific reporter who has taken the church to task for so many of its failures in this regard. Basically said the grand jury in Pennsylvania told only a piece of the story and exaggerated that. And in so doing did a disservice, not necessarily to the church, although that hurt, but to understanding the larger phenomena. So people like you, people at Yale, people in other universities, parents who want to know what the hell's going on, I think we have to make the case. I don't think the institution can say, oh, we're doing a lot better, not us. Not going to work.
But as you say, the cases drop precipitously. But
Pardon?
you mentioned the cases drop precipitously.
Yeah.
So we don't have access to the information and how we managed to achieve that so we can copy it elsewhere.
Yeah.
Do you know how we could get access to that?
The John Jay study?
Or actually just the information of the church from before and after? A lot of it is still...
Actually, I think Father was at this thing. A lot of it is published.
Yes, I was at this study, and Carrie was there too, last Thursday, at Fordham at the Carnegie Hall Center, whatever it is, Lincoln Center, and two women with professional backgrounds in criminology and sociology and so forth presented an extreme PowerPoint, speaking about where the church has been, where it is now, going back to the Dallas Charter. Some people don't even know about the Dallas Charter, and how that has, again, reduced significantly the number of cases. I'm sure that by going on the web, you can break down and find search through it and find through John Jay.
Yeah. What we can do between the two of us, we can get the charts that we saw, and you can get them and have them if somebody wants them. I found them very interesting.
Yeah. But David, more? No.
Giving me some of the information you were saying.
Oh, okay. So John Jay, College of Criminal Justice in New York, they worked on it in 2002 or post-2002, and then have brought the data up to maybe 2017 or so. I'm not just sure. It's pretty recent, though.
Yeah.
I know it's about 7:25 now, 7:30. We want to be on the road by 7:40 to get Amtrak at 8:06. With due respect to my good friend Mary Carney, who bears the same name as my mother, Carney, I don't know if the Protestants have done it better. And again, a part of this dialogue last week was the very fact that it's a societal problem. Yes, the church has risen to the forefront in the media, but it's a societal problem. The issue with sovereign immunity in the public system prevents a lot of what goes on in the school system.
Yeah.
And these criminologists at Fordham mentioned last week how many teachers in the public system in New York who've been accused of sexual abuse are still teaching.
Yeah. And all that's true, and I think we can focus on that. To be honest, it's really different. This is our church. These are people I work for. This happened to me, and it's a good thing we're a model. It would be a better thing, and will be a better thing, when we find a way to bring together the skills, the knowledge, the passion of priests, religious lay people, not only to reform this institution, but to renew our sense of mission. Somebody asked, where are you at this point? And I think I'm going to wrap up with this. And I tried to think about this. Part of it was the 50 years of sex abuse and 50 years of blessings. But I thought, I have been a staffer. I have been a leader. Now I'm a teacher. But most of all, I'm a believer. And so what haunts me is the institution that I invested my hope and my faith in, my belief in Jesus Christ in, failed us in fundamental ways. So now I'm a believer in both trying to make that right, to talk about what happened to me and what happened to lots of other people, but also to encourage others to speak out, to step forward. But I'm also a believer that the world needs what we have. Think about our country. Think about our community. Care for the least, respect for human dignity, care for creation. We need what we have. And so we have to get this right. We have to make this better, not only to protect the young, but to proclaim the gospel, to celebrate the sacraments, and to renew the face of the earth. And this is a place that does all of that. And I'm really proud to be here tonight. Thank you.
John, thank you for opening up this wonderful subject in terms of the ways that you've experienced it. Not a wonderful subject, but a painful subject. But the ways that you have experienced it personally, the ways that folks here have interacted with it, and the thoughts that you have offered to us as we go forward. I want to acknowledge Joe Smythe, who, as you said, here's a person who's been involved in the leadership of the church, a layman. Joe was the director of our Office of Urban Affairs for many, many years. Now it's called the Office of Catholic Social Justice Ministry, Archdiocese of Hartford. Joe, appreciative of your presence tonight. There's also an article in Atlantic about the Jehovah's Witnesses and same struggles that we have. So we recognize the universality of it, but it's our problem right now. We have victims that we have to care for, and our thoughts and prayers are with them. And John, our thoughts and prayers are with you as you continue this work to open it up for us, as well as our thoughts and prayers for you of a safe and on-time journey to Washington. Thank you all for coming.